In the second video, we'll look at George Bush's domestic policies from 1988 to 92. And, in a general thing, Bush was indeed more of a moderate Republican than Reagan. Reagan had taken a lot of criticism because his policies had widened the wealth gap, and he seemed to be a bit harsh on in dealing with the poor. And Bush, he expressed a greater concern for the poor, and he encouraged more volunteerism. He spoke of volunteers as a 1,000 points of light that can make the difference in the life of poor people. It was pretty quickly evident that Bush didn't carry the same clout as Reagan had. And, Democrats, after 8 years of Reagan, they were anxious to attack. When Bush nominated John Tower, a Texas senator who had served as chairman of the Armed Services Committee and had strong credentials, Senate Democrats defeated the nomination, pointing to the accusations of Tower's hard drinking and womanizing. Now, Republicans are really ticked off, and later in 1989, when accusations that Democratic Speaker of the House Jim Wright, who I'll mention later, had sold one of his books beyond the honorarium allowed in House rules, Wright was forced to resign. Anyway, the era of highly partisan personal scandal politics had begun with the Bork nomination and continued to grow during the Bush years. Given the still high debt from the Reagan years, Bush immediately faced the problem of passing a budget within the limits of the earlier Gramm-Rudman budget legislation. And if you recall that set automatic spending cuts if Congress and the president couldn't establish a budget within limits set. Bush eventually endorsed a compromise bill with the Democrats in the so-called Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990. It's a mouthful, but it's just laying out the money that the government had to spend in that fiscal year. Now, this act was notable because, he compromised, and despite his claim showing here that he had not raised taxes, that Budget Reconciliation Act did raise some revenue as well as cutting some spending. And in the end, the legislation, it helped stabilize the budget. It wasn't bad piece of legislation. But by apparently violating his now famous read my lips promise, Bush lost some support among the more ardent fiscal conservatives in his own party. Bush's first Supreme Court nomination was controversial. When Thurgood Marshall, who had been the first African-American Supreme Court justice, retired, Bush appointed Clarence Thomas his successor. And Clarence Thomas, while African American, was not Thurgood Marshall. He was a strict constructionist, very conservative in his interpretation of the Constitution. And this was a nomination the Democrats fought hard, and as part of that nomination process, a former law clerk named Anita Hill testified that Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her, and the nomination was approved, but it got a lot of backlash. Again, this is sort of an indication of the personal attack politics that's becoming more prominent in this age. Later on, Bush is going to nominate David Souter, shown on the bottom right here. Souter was less controversial, but Republicans didn't like him, and indeed, once on the bench, Souter sort of tended to be on the more liberal side of the decisions. Reagan had established the war on drugs, and the executive office of the President of the United States had an Office of Drug Control Policy. Well, Bush selected William Bennett. William Bennett had been Reagan's Secretary of Education and was a real hard-edged conservative. Now Bennett's in charge of the drug control policy and the war on drugs. And so, the effort here is going to be on much more on an enforcement and a little less on treatment of the drugs. One of the more significant bits of legislation that Bush was able to sign was the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. The legislation made discrimination against people with disabilities illegal, and also required governments and private businesses to make, quote, reasonable accommodations for such people. It did, however, allow for some consideration when the requirement on businesses caused undue hardship. But now is when you begin to see public buildings having to have elevators and municipalities having ramps and sidewalks and that sort of thing. It's a really significant piece of legislation that improved the lives of many, many Americans. With the European Union forming and with the rise of China as an economic power, Bush helped pass and sign the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico. It reduced tariffs between the North American countries and sort of created an economic bloc that would have more strength in negotiating with other parts of the world. While Reagan hadn't really done anything in the way of environmental protection, Bush, again more moderate, agreed to sign the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which strengthened the Clean Air Act of 1970. It was prompted by growing concerns over acid rain. This was when sulfur and nitrogen oxides from factories and other polluters combined with moisture in the atmosphere, forming an acid that came down with the rain and really harmed the lakes and forests. And so by signing the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, Bush strengthened America's environmental protections. The environment was obviously an issue when the oil tanker Exxon Valdez hit a reef in Alaska's Prince William Sound early in the Bush administration in 1989. This caused the second worst oil spill in American history, behind only the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. This Exxon Valdez oil spill really destroyed the pristine environment of the area. In response, Bush signed another environmental act, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which mandated adequate cleanup and assigned and defined liability for any future spills. It also phased in a mandate for double-hulled oil vessels. Environmentalists liked this bill, but they thought it was maybe a bit too lenient, but they were angered more by Bush's refusal to strengthen automotive emission standards. Besides signing legislation that established the bailout of the savings and loan crisis he inherited, Bush also signed the Immigration Act of 1990, which led to a 40% increase in the amount of legal immigration. After the now conservative Supreme Court issued rulings and made enforcement of discrimination in employment more difficult, Democrats proposed legislation that made filing discrimination suits easier. While Bush had vetoed similar legislation in 1990, he finally bowed to the political pressure and agreed to sign the Civil Rights Act of 1991. All of these signings sort of showed that Bush was not the arch conservative that Reagan had been. As Bush's term neared its end, his chances of re-election took a hit when the economy began to falter. The recession of 1991-1992 was relatively mild compared to those earlier and I guess later, but job losses were evident well into the election year of 1992. Democrats were anxious to regain the presidency out of being out of the Oval Office for 12 years, and the nation was arguably ready for a change. Moreover, many of Bush's actions as president, I just said, had not endeared himself to, staunch conservatives that were growing in power in his own Republican Party. So Bush wasn't in the best situation going into his re-election in 1992. This concludes the second video on George Bush's domestic policies.